an extremely sensitive covert operation. You'll be one man against an entire squad of high-tech special ops. If you want to survive, you gotta have brains. You have to be in peak physical condition. The fate of the free world is in your hands, soldier. Failure is not an option.
Sir, aren't these tests kind of easy?
Suicide mission.
Metal Gear Solid.
Oh, that's a good one. I can't believe I never saw that growing up. Alright, so at last we are to one of the games I was most excited to revisit when I started this retrospect. So, first of all, Metal Gear. So, the series got start back on the Japanese-only computer, the MSX, and was created by Hideo Kojima, who was a troubled employee at Konami who was struggling to fit into his role at the company due to the fact that he wasn't much of a programmer. A lot of his games just ended up being left incomplete, and Kojima was even considering leaving the company. His bosses tried to throw him a bone by telling him to create a game based on war, which basically meant they wanted him to make Contra. But Kojima realized pretty quickly that he wasn't going to be able to do that on the MSX, so what he decided to do instead was build a game specifically for the MSX, and taking some influence from his favorite movies, The Great Escape, he decided he would make a stealth game, which was unheard of at the time. However, even though people thought Kojima was crazy, the game ended up being an enormous success. It was so popular that it would be ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System, where it was actually a bestseller, and it would even get a sequel called Snake's Revenge. Kojima didn't have any involvement with either, but he would meet with one of the programmers who did work on the NES games, and that would inspire him to make Metal Gear 2, which is still to this day considered the best game that was ever released on the MSX. You would think that after that he would go straight to work on Metal Gear 3, but that's not what he did. Instead, having established a strong reputation at Konami, he went to work on a couple of different projects, namely CD-based games, because being a lover of film, he was fascinated by the full motion video technology. He would create Snatcher on the Sega CD and Policenauts, both of which were critically acclaimed and represent some of the best visual novels of the time. However, as he was finishing up on Policenauts, he started hearing buzz about the PlayStation and its 3D capabilities, and it wasn't long before he started thinking about the game that got him his start and how the whole infiltration experience could be improved with the jump to 3D. He went to his bosses with his plan of attack, got a green light, a nice fat budget, and permission to recruit as many individuals as he felt he needed in order to make his vision a reality. Even though Metal Gear was a cult series in America, when Metal Gear Solid came out, it was just an enormous hit, and to this day is considered one of the biggest landmarks in gaming history. So the plot takes place a couple of years after Metal Gear 2 and sees Solid Snake pulled out of retirement by his former colonel, Campbell, to undertake a mission to Shadow Moses, a nuclear disposal facility that has been taken over by next generation soldiers led by a rogue faction of Foxhound. Snake's mission is to investigate their claims that they can launch a nuke if their demands aren't met, and disarm them if he can, while also rescuing key personnel. However, as Snake begins his mission, he starts to realize that there is quite a bit more to the game, to the events taking place at Shadow Moses than he realizes, and that a ton of worlds are just colliding in this one island. The story of Metal Gear Solid is one of the most groundbreaking aspects of it. Prior to Metal Gear, and I've said this several times during this retrospect and many points beyond, at the time, story in video games was really just context. It was really just justification for whatever you were doing in a game. For example, jumping around as Mario and fighting a turtle dragon, or whatever you call Bowser. You were just doing that to save a princess. Didn't really need any more than that, and a lot of games follow suit. However, when Metal Gear came out, not only was, this story a lot deeper than it was in other games, it was on the level. It was on a level that had never been seen before. Really, there are very few other works of fiction that I can think of that have the same thematic depth, character intrigue, and all that good stuff. Everything that makes a good story that are on the level of Metal Gear. And it's all paced really well too. Like, this game just moves at a very brisk pace. Like, something's always happening as you're playing the game, it seems. And that just makes for one of the most memorable experiences in any video game, period. This was the moment where, it became clear that video games could be more than just, a game you play to kill a few hours. It could actually be as enriching as reading a book, seeing a movie, or doing anything like that. As far as the presentation is concerned, it's also really stellar. While I think the endgame graphics are starting to show their age, particularly in the character models, which look very Muppety, mostly due to the fact that the faces are static, so they kind of look like puppets during the cutscenes. The Shadow Moses facility is still one of the most memorable game worlds in any game, period. You can still show me a screenshot of any point in the game, and I can tell you where in Shadow Moses it is. There are some really cool effects, like the snow effects were just gorgeous for the time. But what really sets MGS apart from other games at the time was its sound. Metal Gear Solid has a great story, but it could have been easily ruined by a bad cast. And you want an example of that happening, just look at the first Resident Evil game. But thankfully, Kojima made it a point not to let that happen. He insisted that a talented cast be brought on for this game. And, that leads to some really good voice acting. David Hayter as Solid Snake, Cam Clark as Liquid Snake. Just so many big... Rob Paulson is in there, too. It's just a star-studded cast of voice actors, and they just do a great job. There's nothing hokey about the voice acting at all, and it makes everything feel more impactful. Like, you really get the sense that everyone who was working on this game realized how good the story was, and they wanted to do everything in their power to make it as good as they possibly could. It really was a team effort. But graphics and narratives are only a small part of the equation. So how is the gameplay in Metal Gear Solid? Well, it's actually pretty damn good. Metal Gear Solid was really the game that popularized the, the stealth genre. Now, again, stealth games have been done before, but much like Resident Evil, this was the game that really put it into the pop culture. So, despite the fact that Snake is a highly trained soldier who is exceptionally skilled, they make it very clear that he is in fact human. So, and he's going up against superhuman soldiers and all kinds of crazy stuff. So, he's outmatched. So if you want to get by in the game, you have to use stealth. And you know what? The stealth system in this game is pretty good. And the reason it is so good, especially compared to Tenchu, is that, it keeps things simple. The game still uses the top-down perspective that the original MSX games did. So the gameplay still functions in a 2D sense, which makes it easy to see where guards are. And you even have a nifty little radar that will point out where guards are looking, which is a godsend throughout most of the game. If you press yourself against a wall or look through like binoculars or a scope or something, you'll actually be able to see in a 3D sense, which can also be useful in analyzing guard patterns and trying to figure out a way to slip through. They keep things simple, but there's just the right amount of depth here to make it work. And for the most part, it still holds up pretty well. However, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of the big problems that Metal Gear Solid had. The big ones for me are the controls. Now, when you're just moving Snake around, trying to avoid guards and doing all that stuff, it's just fine. However, when you're forced into combat, that's where the controls start to show their issues. The shooting in this game is a little finicky. There is a generous auto-aim, but like it doesn't really boil down to more than just finding a place where you think you're safe and then just trying to take out the enemies before they can get their shots off. And a lot of people will say, well, it's a stealth game. You're supposed to avoid combat. And fair, that is a good point. But there are still boss fights in this game. And while the boss fights are a bit better designed, in fact, they can be really good at times. The best one, I think, would probably be the one where you fight Vulcan Raven, where you actually have to use guerrilla warfare to take him out. A lot of them can be a little awkward. The big one I always think of is the battle with Sniper Wolf, which, you know, given the fact that you have to aim with the D-pad as opposed to an analog stick, can be a little hard to line up your shot, and as you're doing that, she's also taking shots at you as well, which, yeah, throws your aim off too, so it's really hard to just line up a shot and take her out before she takes you out. That's a pretty big problem. And there is some obtuse stuff in there as well, like there's one point of the game where you need to get a codex for a character that Stake needs to work with, but rather than just giving it to you, they say it's on the back of the package, and you say, like, what the hell are you talking about? They're talking about the back of the game case, but what if you don't have the game case? I don't think they ever really thought about that, but all that is really small potatoes. Metal Gear, while it is starting to show its age, has aged a lot better than it really has any right to. I definitely would say that I prefer the remake of Metal Gear Solid, you know, the one on GameCube, the Twin Snakes, just because it plays so much better and introduces some mechanics from Metal Gear Solid 2. There is still a benefit to playing the original game as well, so if you're a big fan of game design, especially the artistic and narrative side of things, Metal Gear Solid is essentially required viewing. So, Metal Gear was an enormous hit when it came out, and even today, a lot of people still widely consider it to be one of the best games on the original PlayStation. There were plans to follow it up, at least on Konami's part. Kojima didn't really have much interest in doing it. But, you know, there was still demand for more Metal Gear, so they would eventually re-release the game in Japan with a special edition, which came with another disc that had a bunch of VR missions on it. Some really wacky ones, too, like fighting a Godzilla-sized Genome Soldier, or taking the Cyborg Ninja for a test run, which was really cool. That third disc was eventually re-released here in the States as Metal Gear VR Missions, a standalone game, which is a very underrated game, and it's nowhere near as good as the base game because, you know, it is just a bunch of missions. But, you know, it is still a lot of fun to play, so if you're a big fan of the series, I do recommend checking it out. Eventually, though, Konami would coax Kojima into producing a follow-up, but it took a little bit of time to get that going, so it wouldn't be until the PS2 was out that would come out. And from there would just be a steady string of sequels and spin-offs, most of which maintained a pretty high quality. Unfortunately, Kojima would just start to have a falling out with Konami, and by the time he was at Metal Gear Solid 5, which was a game he really probably did not want to make, things had just reached a fever pitch for them. So before the game was even finished, Konami and Kojima would part ways, and it seemed like that was where the series was going to end, which was unfortunate because while Metal Gear Solid 5 is a very well-designed game, narratively speaking, it is a very poor finale to the Metal Gear series. And when Konami tried to make a game without Kojima, Metal Gear Survive, it was, my god, it was a train wreck. Recently, though, it seems like the series is making a comeback. A remake of the third entry in the series, Metal Gear Solid 3, is due out sometime this year. And while I was a little curious as to why they decided to pick this game instead of doing a remake of like the original Metal Gear, it does kind of make sense to start the remakes with Metal Gear Solid 3 since it is the earliest point in the timeline. They could probably just start remaking the games from there, and, you know, I hope that there's a remake of the first 2 games from the MSX days because, it would just make sense to do so. Those are the 2 entries in the series that people are likely to be unfamiliar with. Whereas fans of the series like myself, if we want to play Metal Gear, we can play Metal Gear. But, no, only time will tell if it's good. I mean, they still have to get this game over with fans. And I guarantee all of which are skeptical of any game being made without Kojima's involvement. Then again, Kojima has kind of gone high on his own ego lately, so maybe it is time to let someone else take the reins. To anyone who worked on Metal Gear Delta, I wish you luck, because you had big shoes to fill. But that's going to do it for Metal Gear Solid, guys. Join me tomorrow as we continue on with the PlayStation Retrospective. I'll see you then.